Welcome, everyone. We will be starting momentarily. We appreciate your punctuality. Seeing
We,
if our
how are we doing, Doug?
we're doing it. I'm confirming we have a HRSA colleague on. I do not see one on yet.
I see Sarah.
Yep,
Uh,
I'm here, Doug.
Oh, welcome, Sarah. All right. I think we have critical mass to be able to call for the quorum.
Great. All right. Welcome everyone to the May 8th Executive Committee call. We'll go ahead and put the quorum link in the chat before we get started.
The quorum link is in the chat, so if I could ask all executive committee members to please click on that link and acknowledge your presence. And once I receive formal acknowledgement on the back end, we can get started. All right, I am happy to announce quorum has been reached.
Great. Well, thank you again and welcome everybody. Just as a reminder that this is an open meeting. The meeting's actually going to be, the first part of the meeting will be open. The executive committee is then going to move into closed session. And again, as a reminder, please turn on your video if possible. Keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. Closed captioning is available if you wish. And please use the raise hand function for questions rather than the chat. Reserve the chat for discussing technical issues you might have with our support team. So with that, next slide. So this is our agenda. We're going to approve the minutes or the summary from the April 10th meeting. That will be a voting item. I'm going to touch briefly on two updates, entertain other or new business, and then the executive committee will move into closed session. Next slide. So the April 10th EC summary meeting minutes were in our boxes. Hopefully everyone had a chance to look at those. We'll take a motion to, or there's a motion that's going to be advanced to approve this. Again, if you were not present at that meeting, please abstain from voting for the minutes. So can I have a motion to support this?
Motion.
A second.
Second.
Okay, great. All right, please, we'll drop the voting in the chat. Thanks. Team.
The link is in the chat. Just let you know once we confirm the vote. Vote has been approved. 8 approve, 0 reject, 1 abstain. Thank you.
Thanks, Tuck. All right, so next, with respect to updates, just two brief updates. They're just actually reminders from issues that had, or things that have been brought up briefly. First is that there is the second National Town Hall, which is going to be held Wednesday, May 13th at 3 p.m. That session, again, is going to include an update on current and upcoming OPTN activities, and there will be also an update from our HRSA colleagues. There are people need to register for these meetings, and there's a link that people can advance questions that they want to have answered during the town hall or subsequently. We've had some good questions in the past and anticipate similar questions in the future. Secondly, everyone knows there's going to the national election for the secretary position and the vice president for patient and donor affairs. That ballot has been distributed. The actual voting will start on May 15th and last until May 22nd. And every eligible OPTN member will be able to vote in that election. As I mentioned, it's for those two positions. The vice president is not on the ballot due to the previously board one-year extension to support board continuity. The newly elected officers will begin their term July 1, 2026. So look forward to that election process. And with that, next
I see it.
slide.
I see one question, Dr. McGee. I think Jen Benson's hand is raised.
Jen?
I'm just curious, do we know what the turnout was on our last town hall meeting? Any idea, just roughly?
Yeah, I can report on that. So we had roughly 850
Hmm.
individuals participate in the first town hall at the highest point. So really
Yeah,
great
that's
turnout. We're
super.
hoping for similar turnout on Wednesday.
That's great. Thank you.
And I also think that we believe that there were occasions where people would be listening as a team too. So, all right. Any other questions? Sorry, I didn't see your hand. All right.
And others.
Okay. With that, I'll open it up for old business, new business, other matters in open discussion before we move into closed section. All right. All right. Well, hearing none, well, the executive committee will now move into closed session. Thank you all for who have tuned in to participate or listen. Thank you.